Good afternoon, and welcome to Make or Break, the Economic Effects of the Minimum Wage. Today's webinar will be recorded and available for viewing at a later date. By joining this session, you are giving consent to be part of a recorded session. Closed captioning is available by clicking on Closed Caption, located in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Also located in the toolbar is a Q&A option. Please feel free to post a question at any time during the webinar, and it will be sent to the meeting host. We hope to answer as many of your questions as possible today. Please note that participants' cameras and microphones will be disabled throughout the webinar, and the chat feature will not be available. Thank you for joining us. And now I'd like to turn the webinar over to Dean John Hurd.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. My name is John Hurd. I'm Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar on the economic effects of the minimum wage, to which over 600 people have registered. Clearly, this is an important and timely topic. Professor Aaron Dubay is the economist on the impacts of the minimum wage. Nobel laureate and New York Times columnist Paul Krugman tweeted that Aaron is, quote, the go-to guy on minimum wages and an exemplar of modern data-driven economics, end quote. Bloomberg News calls him the world's leading authority and says his work has shaped a new consensus on the economic impacts of the minimum wage. And Aaron's lived it, earning the minimum wage of $3.85 an hour at McDonald's in Seattle in the late 1980s. Professor Dubay is a careful, exacting scientist whose work has significant and immediate public policy implications. He's a University of Chicago trained economist whose conclusions go where the data take him, without ideology or exaggeration or hyperbole. The UMass Economics Department, where Aaron teaches, is an extraordinary group of scholars whose impact is wide-ranging. And you're in for a treat today, listening to and interacting with someone who knows the economics of the minimum wage better than anyone. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Robert Nackerstein. He's a department chair and professor of operations and information management at the Eisenberg School of Management. Robert?
Thank you, Dean Hurd. And let me just reinforce something the Dean said. And there really couldn't be a more timely, relevant, and urgent topic than the minimum wage and the potential raising of the minimum wage. A quick bit of personal perspective. When I was a doctoral student in the 1970s, pretty much the entire profession of economists, both academic and non-academic, thought that raising the minimum wage would hurt those individuals that it was most designed to help. Those less qualified, those with less education, younger workers, and minority workers. Beginning in the early 1990s, this point of view began to change with some pretty exciting and creative research. And today, there has been a real turnaround in the view of economists on the minimum wage. It is now viewed as far more nuanced and where the outcomes are far more selective, if you will. So without further ado, let me turn this over to Professor Dubay. Thank you for being here. Thank you for doing this, Professor.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure. I'm glad you could join us today. I'm going to begin with a short presentation on some of the key questions and evidence on minimum wage. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And Robert, can you see this shared screen all right?
Yes. Well, it just disappeared. There we go. Yes, indeed I can.
Okay, let me just redo that one more time. Just bear with me here. There we go.
Yep, there you go.
Excellent. So it's a useful question to ask why actually have a minimum wage, or what really is a minimum wage. So just for, this is probably something given your interest on the topic since you're attending today, but the minimum wage is the lowest wage that can be paid to someone at an hourly rate when they're working for you. And that in the United States, it applies to most workers, not all. That wasn't always the case. In fact, we didn't have our first minimum wage at the national level until 1938, when the Fair Labor Standards Act established the first national minimum wage. Back then, in nominal terms, it was 25 cents an hour. And importantly, it covered only 43% of the workforce. In fact, if you think about who minimum wage workers are today, those in restaurants and retail and service jobs, those people were not covered initially when the minimum wage was established back in 1930s. It was also initially most binding in the South, which was and still to a certain extent is a lower wage region where there's more lower wage jobs. And at that time, the wages there were about half the level of the rest of the United States. The coverage of minimum wage, which workers are covered, has expanded. And it expanded substantially in the 60s when a lot of the service work was brought under the minimum wage coverage. And today, among non-agricultural workers, it is close to 100% in most cases. Well, it's close to 100% for non-agricultural workers who are statutory employees. So if you're an independent contractor, for example, it may not, you are not bound by the minimum wage law. But it's not just the federal minimum wage that's at play here today in the US. It's also that there's increasing number of states and cities that have established minimum wages. So right now we have 29 states and the District of Columbia that have a minimum wage that exceeds the federal standard. And that's important because here in Massachusetts, we have a minimum wage of $13.50 an hour, while the federal minimum wage is only $7.25 an hour. And in fact, if you look to see around the country, you'll see a number of states have minimums exceeding $11 an hour. That includes states like Washington, Oregon, California, also Arizona and Colorado. And there's a number of states that actually have somewhere between the federal standard and $11. It's also interesting to note that states, including Florida, have embarked on a path towards $15 an hour over the coming 4, 5, 6 years. But we can also see that even with the federal state minimum wages, we have a large swath of the country, 21 states, that actually are still at the federal minimum, which has not been raised for about a dozen years now. The last time it was raised was 2009. And in fact, what we have, if we look at how minimum wages have evolved over time, you see a really interesting pattern. After the Second World War, the minimum wage, and here in red, this is in real dollars, not in nominal dollars, the minimum wage, the median wage, as well as sort of average productivity, all grew together. This was a time when inequality was not rising; it was really relatively stable, and the minimum wage was updated just about every year. And that changed starting in 1980s. As you can see, the minimum wage actually fell in inflation-adjusted terms during the 1980s, as it was not raised in that period. And you start seeing a gap emerge between minimum wage, the median wage, and overall productivity in the economy. We can also compare what's happening in the United States with what's happening in other countries. And of course, it's hard to compare a dollar in minimum wage in dollar terms to minimum wage in pounds or other currencies. So one way economists often think about the strength or the level of the bite of the minimum wage is by comparing it to the median wage in the economy, what the middle person is earning. And here, what you can see is that, if you went back to the 60s, 70s, the minimum wage as a share of the median wage was maybe around, as high as 55% here in the US, a bit below what other advanced industrialized countries were paying, but it was pretty similar. But since then, here in blue, we have the US today. The minimum wage as a share of the median is something below 35%, versus in other high income countries, it's somewhere between 55 and 60%. So again, we can see compared to other rich countries, the United States federal minimum standard has not kept up. So what does that do when you actually don't raise the minimum wage? Well, we actually do have evidence from that, because in the United States, as I mentioned, we went through in the 1980s for a long period where we didn't raise the minimum wage. We have done that again in more recent years. So economists have studied this question, and this is a question actually most economists agree on, that minimum wages very clearly reduced wage inequality. So you can hear, this is a graph showing the change in wages by wage percentile in response to an increase in the minimum wage. This is from work by David Otter, an economist at MIT, along with his co-authors Alan Manning and Chris Smith from a few years back. And what they found is really compelling evidence that wages rise in the bottom, maybe 20% of the income distribution when the minimum wage rises. So what they also found is that between 1979 and 2009, the stagnation of the federal minimum wage could explain maybe between a half and a third of the increase in the inequality in the bottom part of the labor market. So clearly, minimum wage has played a role in explaining some of the rise in increase inequality in this country. Of course, if minimum wages raise wages at the bottom, which is most people think is a good thing, why not always do it? Why is it controversial? So here the question becomes, besides the intended consequence of raising wage and lowering inequality, are there also unintended consequence? And in particular, are there jobs that are destroyed when jobs have to pay a certain wage? And that this is the worry that that has really been a focus of a lot of work on this topic. How much do we see jobs being reduced when the wages they have to pay is raised via government mandate? So before I launch into some of the evidence on this question, let me just say that this remains a topic with disagreement amongst well-meaning and smart economists. At the same time, I do think we know a lot more today than we did in the past. So what's so hard about it? Why not just look at what happens? What happens when you raise the minimum wage? So the key challenge here is we have to figure out what would have happened had the minimum wage not been raised. This is what we call the counterfactual. It's like if you had a lab, you could randomly allocate minimum wages to some states and not others, and see what happens in the states that are treated versus states that are controlled. But we, of course, in real world can't quite do that. And so we have to settle for what we call natural experiments. So when we see some states go ahead and raise their minimum wage, like Massachusetts has been doing, versus other states that have not, like New Hampshire. So then the issue becomes, can you compare Massachusetts and New Hampshire very well? Or which states can you compare more credibly, more reliably? And this is where it gets harder. And this is why we have spent a lot of time trying to really look at this question and get a reliable answer. And sometimes there's disagreements because, again, causal inference in social sciences is hard. Now, this all began, as Robert mentioned, so in the early 90s. This was really when this literature of new minimum wage literature really picked up. And the reason that it happened is because we suddenly had minimum wages that were different in different places as states started raising their minimums in the 1980s and 1990s, as the federal government ended up ended up not raising it for extended periods of time. And so this gave an opportunity to study these control versus treatment units or states. And the economists who really were pioneers in this were David Card and the late Alan Krueger, who in a study in 1994 really shook up the profession. What they did was to compare New Jersey and Pennsylvania. New Jersey passed a minimum wage increase, Pennsylvania did not in 1992. And so what they did is they went and surveyed fast food restaurants in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, like Wendy's and Burger King and KFC and the like, and in both sides of the border. So here you can kind of visualize here. Here in New Jersey, in purple, is the state that's raising the minimum wage. That's your treated unit. Just neighboring county in Pennsylvania is not raising the minimum wage, even though they share a lot of similar characteristics, similar labor market, local labor market. So what did they find? So what they found was something that was surprising. And in particular, this is what they did. So they found, if you look at New Jersey, before versus after the minimum wage, there was a small positive increase in number of workers in each restaurant on average. On average, about half a worker additional in a restaurant in New Jersey after the minimum wage rose, versus in Pennsylvania, actually, there was the state that did not raise the minimum wage. There was a small reduction in the number of jobs. Of course, why is there a reduction? Well, there's lots of stuff that goes on, and that Pennsylvania, if you use that as the counterfactual, kind of like what would have happened in New Jersey had New Jersey not raised the minimum wage, then you sort of subtract the negative 0.21 from positive 0.6, and you get what's called a difference in difference estimate, that the minimum wage, if you take this literally, seems to have raised employment slightly on the side of the border, New Jersey, that actually raised the minimum wage. So this was I'm simplifying here, but this was a very sharply contentious paper that led to a lot of follow-up work and a lot of arguments. But it really, it really sort of took advantage of an empirical approach to studying the problem and really trying to dig into the data to see what was actually going on, as opposed to simply relying on models or intuition. So New Jersey, Pennsylvania was really interesting and useful and important, but it was still a single case study. And there's a lot of other idiosyncratic factors that can come in when you have a single case like that. So in follow-up work in 2010 with my co-authors, Bill Lester and Michael Reich, we generalized the case study approach by taking all counties across the state borders in the US, where one side raised the minimum wage, one side did not, between 1990 and 2006. And here just is a map here, and all the counties in reds are ones that we can actually use because they had different minimum wages, at least at some point on each side of the border. And what we found was actually very similar to what Card and Krueger found, but we were able to look at it over longer horizons. So we found, for example, on the left panel, studying restaurants, earnings in restaurants clearly rose at the time the minimum wage increased, and stayed higher on the side of the border following the minimum wage increase up to 16 quarters. That's about 4 years following the minimum wage. So we're looking at a pretty long period after the policy change. At the same time, the right panel, we look at what was happening to restaurant employment. Gee, it just stayed pretty much the same. That there was really no clear difference in the minimum wage in the employment levels on the two sides of the border before the increase or after the increase. So again, this was confirming that minimum wage increases seem to successfully raise the wage at the bottom without really harming overall employment in the restaurant sector at that point. So I'm gonna, sorry, I just misplaced. So at this point, there isn't a whole lot of disagreement on what the impact is in sectors like restaurants and retail. Most people seem to find that they're relatively small. There is more disagreement on what happens to employment for particular groups, especially, for example, teens or young workers. But that also leaves open the question, what's the impact on overall number of low-wage jobs, as opposed to, particular sectors like restaurant or particular groups like teens. And to really answer this, in a relatively recent paper published in 2019 with my co-authors, we developed a new but relatively simple method of really capturing what the impact on the low-wage jobs is overall. And here is a picture that hopefully can convey the methodology here. What we're doing is we're looking at $1 buckets of around the minimum wage. So let's say the minimum wage rises to $10 an hour. What happens to the number of jobs paying below $10 an hour? That's in yellow. Unsurprisingly, that is reduced because those jobs are presumably either paying higher or are no longer in place. So yes, there's fewer jobs paying below the new minimum, but then if you look at how many jobs are paying exactly at or just above the minimum, it turns out it's about the same as the fewer jobs in yellow. And so when you add these two up, the missing jobs in yellow and the excess jobs in purple, it turns out that overall impact on low-wage jobs up to 4 or 7 years after the policy seemed to have been pretty small. And here we're studying 138 different minimum wage increases to get a better, more robust sense of what's going on. So, there's other things we did in that paper that also tried to clarify why economists seem to have disagreed on the evidence in some cases. But the takeaway from this research was, at least to date, the minimum wage impact on overall impact on low-wage jobs seems to actually have been relatively modest. So, actually in 2019, I was asked by the Treasury in the United Kingdom to actually summarize this type of evidence for them in helping them decide on what to do with the minimum wage. And I did that, and I wrote a report. And as part of the report, I gathered evidence on a way to make the various studies' findings more comparable. And so what I did is to compare what's called, and this is a technical term, but own wage employment elasticity. The idea is simple though. If you divide the employment change by whatever the wage change was because of the minimum wage increase, that gives you a good handle on overall how negative the job effects might be. So for example, if it turns out you're raising wages by 10% work for low-wage workers, and now there's 2% fewer number of jobs, that'll be something like negative 0.2. That means low-wage workers still come out quite a bit ahead because the wage gains are a lot more than job losses. And that's what I did. That's actually what I found when I looked across the body of literature. Here I'm showing from both US and UK and other countries. What I found is that the median study seems to find something like wage gains are maybe 6 times as larger as job losses. Now, if you actually look at studies that look at not narrow groups but broader groups, that number seem to be even smaller. And this has actually led to changes in economists' perception of and beliefs about how minimum wages are actually affect the economy. So, Robert mentioned in the 1970s, when he was in grad school, most economists actually believed that the minimum wage is substantially lower employment among low-wage workers. In fact, that's what was found in this 1978 American Economic Association member survey. But then if you look at by 2000, that number had fallen to something like 46%. While we don't have exact apples to apples comparison in more recent years, if you look at an IGM panel of prominent economists who were asked questions about what would happen if the minimum wage were raised to $9 or $15 an hour, the share that actually thought that there would be very clear substantial reductions in employment is a minority one. That's not to say everyone thinks that it's not going to have any effect. It's just more nuanced. And this change, I think, reflects better evidence that is being both produced and digested in the profession. So how I'm doing on time? I think this would be probably a good enough place for me to stop. I could continue on, but maybe we can now have more of a conversation.
All right, well, thank you. That was very edifying. I always judge a seminar or a presentation by how much it deepens my understanding of the topic, and this certainly did. One more piece of personal perspective: when the Card and Krueger paper came out in 1994 that Professor Dubé mentioned, there was simply a lot of outright disbelief. Um, Even people such as myself who wanted to believe the result simply didn't believe the result. And it took an accumulation of subsequent studies that were somewhat mixed, but pretty much all pointing in the same direction for the profession to turn around in the way that Professor Dubé's data there on from the American Economic Association and other data represent. So I have a bunch of questions. Thank you to those of you who have submitted questions. We have sort of culled, all of them were good questions. We've picked out the ones that seem to make the most sense. And I'm going to try and be organized in how I go through and ask Professor Dubé to comment on them. So first question, in imposing a higher minimum wage, should consideration be taken to impose different minimum wages in different regions that have different costs of living?
That's a great question. And, it's something that is both interesting as well as very relevant in the current policy discussions in Congress. So I think here's a couple of ways to think about it. One way to think about what the federal minimum wage does is to set a federal floor. And then states and increasingly cities can go above that. This turns out to be what we end up doing in practice. So for example, we have the federal minimum wage that's $7.25 an hour, but then we have higher income, higher wage, higher cost of living states like here in Massachusetts or California, Washington, that have all gone substantially above that. And so that ends up being a way of allowing for having variations across areas while setting a single federal floor. Is that the only way to do things? I don't think it is. It's also possible one could have a federal floor that itself varies by region. So one could be that depending on the median wage, you could, for example, set the minimum wage at, let's say, 2/3 of the median wage in the state. If you were to do that today, it would probably be around $17.50 or so in Massachusetts and something like $11.50 in West Virginia. Is that better than having a single standard and allowing states to go above? I think reasonable people can disagree on that question.
Thank you. This next question, I think, kind of gets to the core of the controversy about the minimum wage. How will small businesses be able to absorb a substantial increase in minimum wage without adversely affecting their business model?
Yeah, so what we actually do have a lot of evidence on is how businesses end up absorbing the cost increase. And it turns out most cases, the cost increases are absorbed via price increases. So when all businesses face a similar common cost shock, it's much easier to pass it through as prices. So a substantial minimum wage increase could lead your burger to cost maybe 50 cents more. In fact, typically that's what happens when the minimum wage is substantially raised. So what does that mean? It means that the minimum wage is not exactly a free lunch. Quite literally, it costs food a bit more. Lunch will be a little more pricey. But it allows middle and higher income consumers in net to pay for higher wages at the bottom of the pay scale. So that's one and probably the most important way of absorption of the minimum wage increase. There is also evidence that there's some reductions. There may be some productivity offsets. So for example, turnover falls quite substantially when the minimum wage rises. That does offset part of the cost increase. Definitely not the case that somehow makes it costless to raise the minimum. That's why we see the price increases quite important. But the productivity offsets also do seem to exist. And finally, in some cases, there are some reductions in profits, though I think that ends up being more relevant for larger, more profitable businesses than smaller restaurants or other smaller businesses.
Good answer. Thank you. Here's kind of a philosophical question. Why doesn't the free market work? It should be that employers couldn't find enough people willing to work for such low wages. But I think the basic question is, why do we need a government imposed minimum wage? Why doesn't the free market work the way it's supposed to?
Right. Now, some people may say that it does work and you don't need a minimum wage. If you sort of have a libertarian perspective, you would say that in fact it is it's an unnecessary undue burden on the freedom to contract. But then the question becomes, what are the outcomes that we see if we don't have a minimum? And then as a society, we can ask and answer whether we think that's a reasonable outcome. So we do know what happens in part because we didn't always have a minimum wage. And also in part, we've let the minimum wage fall so low in real terms in parts of the country where it's barely binding. So you can see what the world looks like when you have very low, almost not binding minimum wage. And what it looks like is you have some businesses, not all, some businesses offering quite low wages. And that is more likely to happen when employers have a degree of market power in the labor market. Sometimes we call that monopsony power. So when employers do have some degree of wage setting power, what you get paid is not simply determined by your productivity and a market for price of skills, but rather also depending on wage policies pursued by employers. So similar workers end up getting paid differently based on where they are, and some employers, especially lower productivity companies, end up paying lower wages when in contrast, if you had a minimum wage, that would raise and create a baseline standard for most workers. So the extent to which you think that the low wage labor market is one where employers have a degree of asymmetric bargaining power, and I do think the evidence would point in that direction, the more you may think that raising the minimum wage actually has a salutary impact on the functioning of the market besides for equity or fairness reasons.
Thank you. Somebody's asked the question about whether part-time employees should be subject to the minimum wage and whether by not putting them under that umbrella would be an aid to small businesses.
So I think if you have exemptions based on hours, that can create some pretty clear perverse incentives, right? So if I said you didn't have to pay a minimum wage if you worked 20 hours or less, that's pretty much providing a high-powered incentives to businesses to hire more part-time workers. So I think hours-based restrictions would have a problem for that reason. And for that, and I actually, while there are exemptions, across history and across countries, et cetera, by different types, by different, things, including age restrictions. Hours-based cutoff is not one of them, and I would be worried about those perverse incentives were you to have a hours-based cutoff.
Okay, thank you. The Congressional Budget Office reports that the $15 minimum wage would result in the loss of millions of jobs. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's an important question, and it's a timely question. So the Congressional Budget Office looked at a number of studies. They actually specifically looked at 11 studies to try to come up with their projection of what they think would happen when the minimum wage is raised. Now, before let's be clear that they're tasked to figure out what would happen if the minimum wage is raised to $15. There's some uncertainty and legitimate unknowns because we have not had an equivalent of a $15 federal minimum wage in this country in the past. But with all of that said, so CBO estimated that about 27 million workers would get a raise if we raised the minimum wage to $15 by 2025. They also estimated that this would lift around 1 million workers out of poverty. At the same time, they estimated there would be 1.4 million fewer jobs as a result. So if you take these projections, it suggests that there are a lot greater increase in wages for these 27 million workers than the fewer jobs that there would be, 1.4 million. It may, for example, take you on average several extra days longer between jobs when you're looking for a job, so that creates some higher unemployment rate as you spend longer between jobs. But when you have a job, it pays a lot more. So that's one way it could be actually absorbed. So I think overall, their projections suggest that low-wage workers would still come out quite a bit ahead. Having said that, I think there are really important reasons why I think the CBO's employment estimates are too pessimistic. So I mentioned they drew on these 11 studies and ended up putting more weight on a few outliers. Just to be perfect, just to be clear, those 11 studies included, my work as well, but it included several studies that were that suggested really large job losses. And one of these was a study from the Seattle minimum wage, which found job losses would be something like 3 times as large as wage gains, which is really just very much an outlier compared to the literature. It was one of the data points in that figure that I showed you that I compiled for the UK Treasury, looking at the elasticities, and this was one that was by far sort of an outlier. Now, the same authors subsequently used a different method in their final published version of the paper that found employment effects that were 1/10 as large. So unfortunately, the CBO report actually looked at their original estimates, but did not include the more recent estimates that were 1/10 as large. And in fact, in their most recent projection, ended up putting more weight on that study that they had done in 2019, the last time they did this. So overall, if you use a similar methodology as the CBO, but look at more updated and a broader set of estimates, like I did for my report for the UK Treasury, I think you would find there may be something like several 100,000 fewer jobs as opposed to 1.4 million fewer jobs. Again, using similar methodology as the CBO, and if 27 million workers got a raise.
Well, you anticipated one of the questions about your old hometown of Seattle, where you earn the minimum wage. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. Do you think that there's a question about studies on the minimum wage varying so widely? Do you think that studies currently on the minimum wage do come out with widely varying results? And if so, why?
Right. I mean, that's a fantastic question, and this is exactly what we wrestle with and grapple with. Again, just a starting point, I would just say that we should all acknowledge that causal inference in social sciences is hard. We can't just randomize minimum wages like we can randomize a vaccine to try to gauge its efficacy. So we have to look at actual variation that exists in the world and then try to draw the best answer we can. So I think the Seattle minimum wage example turns out to be really an interesting lens into understanding why economists sometimes disagree, and how even reasonable and smart researchers can end up getting different conclusions. So the Seattle was the first city to raise its minimum wage to up to $15 an hour. So a set of researchers from University of Washington studied what happened to the number of low-wage jobs in Seattle following the minimum wage increase, and compared to other parts of the state of Washington. Actually, using a pretty similar methodology as that bar graph that I showed you, like there's fewer jobs paying below $15, more jobs paying exactly at or slightly higher than $15. And what they found is that the number of jobs paying less than $19 an hour in Seattle fell quite a bit compared to other parts of the state. Now, why look at other parts of the state? Well, because that's the data they were using. The good news is they had this really cool matched worker business employer data with hours covering just about 90%, 95% of workers in the state of Washington. The bad news is it only covered the state of Washington. And so you're trying to compare what's happening to the number of jobs paying below $19 in Seattle to other smaller cities or more rural areas in Washington state at a time when wages were rising much faster in Seattle than other parts of the state. And so the problem is if you find fewer jobs paying below $19 an hour, you don't necessarily know if that's because those jobs exist and are paying better, as opposed to simply they were no longer in anywhere. They were killed. And so that's the conclusion they drew, was that those jobs were lost. But I think that's a mistaken conclusion. And when they ended up in their follow-up work tracking workers as opposed to just number of jobs, they found that most workers who were earning below $15 an hour before the policy changed actually ended up still working, maybe slightly lower hours, but substantially greater increase in wages. In a follow-up work that just came out in the Journal of Economic Literature, my co-author Attila Lindner and I looked at 21 cities that raised their minimum wage. And we followed a similar methodology as the original Seattle study, but we matched these cities with other cities that didn't raise their minimum wage, but were also higher wage, larger metropolis, as opposed to looking at rural areas in Washington state. And what we found is that, in fact, exactly these 21 cities, including Seattle, were able to raise wages without substantially affecting the number of low-wage jobs, which is much more consistent with the University of Washington team's second study that also seemed to have reached a similar conclusion.
Okay, this question I think kind of answers itself. One of our participants wonders why we keep chasing our tail about the minimum wage. Why do we keep having this debate and have legislative action to raise the minimum wage? Why don't we just pin it to the cost of living? I think, as I say, I think it answers itself, but maybe you can talk about the politics of that if you feel comfortable doing so.
Yeah, but this is exactly right. Why do we do this? Why do we go for a dozen years without raising the minimum wage, and then then you have to deal with the fact that any minimum wage increase is going to be large. Well, if you haven't raised it for 12 years, it's hard to have a very small increase. The good news is that some states, less than a dozen, actually do index their minimum wage to usually the inflation rate, the CPI. The other thing you can do is you can index it to the median wage. So this is what's sometimes done in other countries. For example, the UK pegs it to about now between 60 and 65% of their median wage. Just to put in perspective, $15 by 2025 would be around 2/3 of the median wage here in the US. So in the bill in Congress that the Democrats passed in the House, that would peg it to 2/3 of the median. That would peg it to the median wage after reaching $15 by 2025. And I think whatever level you pick, I think it's really important to index it, because for exactly this reason, so you don't just both waste time over and over again arguing about the same thing, and also really have an inefficient way of doing things where you let the minimum wage stagnate for a bunch of years and then have sharper increases. So one interesting and maybe slightly surprising reason why even Democratic leaning states have not raised the minimum wage so much is it does give politicians an ability to say, hey, we did something, and get credit for that. And so generally, then you end up having Republican legislatures who are opposed to it based on ideological or principle grounds, and then Democratic legislatures who sort of let the indexation go by the wayside, because then it allows them to actually raise it every year. Actually, some years back, I was asked of the Connecticut state legislature to sort of talk about the minimum wage, and I did, and I sort of asked them, like, why don't you raise the minimum wage. If you look at Connecticut, it actually ends up raising it pretty regularly. It's like, oh, we like to raise it ourselves. So it just seems an odd task for legislatures to sort of mimic what a simple formula would do. But that's kind of, I think, some of the politics of it.
Best to take credit when you can, I suppose. Professor Dubé, is there any evidence that people move from low minimum wage states to higher minimum wage states?
So there is some evidence that migrant workers maybe are attracted more to states that have higher minimum wages. I don't think there's much evidence that workers actually, like certainly native born workers, move in response to, or people who already are at a certain state move in response to the minimum wages. It may, but in general, the mobility patterns don't seem very strongly related to minimum wage differences.
Some of the questions here to see if I can come up with some more conversation.
So I think, one thing that may be worth.
Thank you for stepping in when I was going quiet.
Sure, no problem. In terms of how businesses respond and why don't they respond, and I think it's one interesting fact is that when you actually do see more stronger evidence of job loss, it turns out to be in the manufacturing sector. And the reason for that is also consistent with what I was saying in terms of the ability for businesses like restaurants to pass on cost increases as prices. That's much easier to do if your business is basically locally, it's a not tradable goods or service. It's something that's actually price for which is determined more locally, like a price of a burger versus price of apparel or shoes. So we do actually see both in US as well as other countries that the manufacturing employment might be more negatively impacted than when the minimum wage rises. But in the US, manufacturing is a very small share of low wage work, really work overall at this point, which is which is another reason why it can potentially explain why we see relatively more muted impact of minimum wages and employment in more recent years.
Do you see, I've heard this said before, that when companies offer very low wages, when a state has a very low minimum wage, that what they're doing is they're asking the federal government to subsidize workers through various federal programs such as food stamps. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, so the way I would sort of put it is more that when wages are low, it is true that workers and family members will use more public assistance. And we should think that's a good thing, that there are public assistance that can help when wages are low. But it does mean when you raise wages, then they rely less on public assistance. So what I found, for example, that if you look at what happens to the family income distribution when you raise wages, in general, you see strong increases in family pre-tax income in sort of the bottom 30% of the distribution. But for every dollar increase in income, pre-tax income, there's maybe about 30 cents, 35 cents reduced use of public assistance, for example, food stamps and other tax credits. So about 35 cents on the dollar of a minimum wage increase actually does get plowed back to taxpayers in the form of reduced use of public assistance.
Professor Dubé, there's a lot of talk today about artificial intelligence and automation taking over jobs. Do you think that raising the minimum wage just prompts that kind of switch over, that people will, not so much in the short term, but in the intermediate and longer term, that people are going to be replaced by automation, really as a direct result of raising the minimum wage?
Yeah, so that's certainly a concern that we hear a lot about. So I think there's a few things to note. One, automation is certainly something that's been around and will be around, and including in the low wage sector. I think it ends up replacing the kinds of tasks we do more than just reducing demand for labor per se. So it allows us to sort of rebundle tasks for jobs, getting rid of the most routine intensive tasks out of what we may end up doing, and allowing us to maybe focus on other things, including things that maybe actually be less monotonous. But of course, that's sort of a theoretical point. What's the empirics? What does the data show? I find the most compelling evidence actually just came out of a couple of months ago by economists from Princeton, Orley Ashenfelter, who's actually a very well-known economist who's actually trained many economists who've worked on the minimum wage. But what he did is to look at a particular chain, McDonald's, and looked at what happened to McDonald's use of touchscreen technology, which is sort of the most, I think, the most obvious example of technological adoption that may actually reduce the need for human interface. And we certainly have seen there's been, increase in use of touchscreen technology. What this, again, they're comparing states that raised the minimum wage versus did not. They did not find any evidence that higher minimum wage states saw greater use of touchscreen technology by franchises, McDonald's franchises in those states. So instead, they did see, consistent with what we've said, a clear price pass-through to the price of burgers. They have this thing called the Big Mac Index, which actually measures like how much this is the Big Mac Labor Index, which is how much the wage compares to the price. And in fact, they found that there was almost full pass-through of cost increase to price increases, but really very little indication of additional increase in adoption of technology.
Hey, do you know of any evidence that would address the issue of when minimum wages are raised for, say, line workers in a fast food restaurant? Are there complementary increases to supervision of those workers and on up the sort of distributional chain within a company?
Yeah, the great question. So this is an area that that I've actually done some work on myself. So the short answer is, if the minimum wage rises to about $10 an hour, you'll see some wage increases up to maybe $13 or so, $13, $14 an hour. Beyond that, there won't be any increases. So you can actually see, you could have seen it in that little graph that I showed you with the bar charts with the number of jobs paying at above the minimum wage. You can see there's a hike right in the dollar bucket above the minimum, and then 3 more buckets also see some increases, and that's indicating that there's sort of this wage spillover that's happening, and there's nothing beyond that. And why does that happen is an interesting question as well. And it turns out a lot of that does have to do with keeping some pay, being able to keep some pay differences. For example, the supervisor versus the line worker difference. So it turns out, if you look at a $13 wage worker, right? Like the minimum wage rises to $10 an hour. Does a worker making $13 an hour get a raise? It turns out they're more likely to get a raise if there are $10 workers working in the same business than not. Because if there are $10 workers making the same business, they may have, the $13 person may be their supervisor, and you got to keep that differential at least somewhat in place. And so the $13 person is more likely to get a raise when they're lower wage workers, again, indicating this sort of relative pay comparisons mattering in setting pay.
That's good. Thank you. Anybody who's worked, as you and I have, studying labor markets is very familiar with the term non-agricultural workers. What about agricultural workers? Are they left out of this? What's the reasoning for it? Can you comment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the federal minimum wage does not cover agricultural sector. As I mentioned, initially, the federal minimum wage mostly covered manufacturing and tradable goods sectors, but over time, it expanded substantially to cover service jobs. Agriculture was left out. And is there a good reason for it? I'm not sure that there is, but I think, except that basically agriculture is sort of been seen as a migratory workforce that actually has that essentially is somehow a segmented market compared to the rest of the labor market. Like at this point, most ag workers in the U.S. may not actually go back and forth between other types of jobs. They're more likely to go back and forth across countries. That's one argument that's made. I guess another argument that one could make is that if, as I mentioned, if the prices of the agricultural goods are not set locally and it's more sort of tradable, that there may be potentially, more deleterious impacts on employment. Having said that, their state minimum wages actually don't necessarily exclude minimum agricultural workers. For example, in California, which has a lot of ag workers, in fact, the state minimum wage covers them. And so I think I would be hard pressed to come up with a very compelling argument to not have some minimum wage coverage at the federal level for agricultural workers, but that's historically been the case.
Here's a good question, maybe a little off the wall. Is there any evidence from consumer expenditure studies that raising the minimum wage causes big pattern differences in consumer spending in households? And the specific question had to do with spending on healthcare. There are a lot of anecdotes about people postponing vital healthcare because they simply can't pay for it. Is there any evidence that raising the minimum wage actually overcomes these kinds of problems?
Great question. We do have evidence on spending pattern, and while I don't know of evidence finding and change impact on healthcare spending, what we do find is that there's increased expenditures, including expenditures in food away from home, like restaurant eating in restaurants, again, which is actually interesting because that's also a low wage sector. That, and also reduced debt. People pay down debt, except in one important category where debt actually increases, loans increase, which is for buying used cars. So minimum wage workers, when you get a big raise, and end up actually paying down most debt, but are more able to afford buying a car, which is actually important because that might also increase the radius of job search that they can actually do, an overall increase in consumption. Now, so I think, like, one argument is like, well, these are low wage workers. They're more likely to spend their income. They have high, what we call marginal propensity to consume. And that is true. And that actually is, although part of it is that they also end up paying down debt. Some people then take that to the next step and say, well, this is another argument for having minimum wage because it boosts demand and creates jobs. I think there's a little bit of that, but I think one has to be careful because minimum wage income is such a small part of the overall GDP that you wouldn't expect a very sizable impact from a minimum wage increase on aggregate demand per se, though there may be in some specific cases and locales.
Okay, I think we're getting near the end, so I think you need to talk quickly. This may be more a thought experiment question than an empirical one. You talked about the pass-through of increased wages on prices, especially perhaps in restaurants. Do you think in that case that people pay lower tips? If they're paying a higher price for their meals, are they less generous in their tipping behavior?
Yeah, we don't have great evidence. There's a lot of anecdotes on that. So there was, so that anecdotally, people may pay lower tips when you have increased minimum wage. Part of the issue is that tips are hard to get really good data on, and so for that reason, it's something that I haven't actually seen really compelling evidence on that question.
Okay, well, I think that about does it. It's been a really enjoyable hour. What I said earlier was that if a presentation could deepen my understanding of an issue, it's been a success, and this has certainly been a success. I want to thank the Alumni Affairs Office for sponsoring this. I want to thank Dean John Hurd for his support, and the Eisenberg Dean Ann Massey, for her support. And of course, most of all, I want to thank Professor Aaron Dubé for a wonderful presentation and in the Q&A as well. Thank you very much, and thank you all for attending. It's been great to have you. Bye-bye.